Alright guys, so welcome to this video. In this video we are going to look at human resource management through the years. Now there are different areas of a business or a company or an organization. That could include human resources, marketing and promotion, customer service, sales, accounting and finance, etc. Now the different areas of the business, different functions. For example, you would have producing type areas, you would have selling type areas, which would include obviously sales, marketing, market research, etc. And you also have supporting type functions. Human resource management provide a supporting type function to all other aspects of the organization or the company. But not only do human resource management provides supporting functions, they are now strategic partners of the organization as a whole, and we will talk about that as we begin to have a conversation on the evolution of human resource management. Now the simplest definition we can talk about in terms of human resource management is to say it is concerned with all aspects of how people are employed and managed within organizations. And it even takes into consideration persons being separated from the organization, which at some point in our course we would come to that. Armstrong 1995 defined human resource management as the process and practice of getting people into organizations, assessing and rewarding their performance, and developing their full potential for the achievement of organizational objectives. This is a solid definition. If I had to do anything with this definition, I might have just reorganized. I would have reorganized the wording to say it's the process and practice of getting people in the organization, developing their full potential for achievement of organizational objectives, assessing and rewarding their performance. So I might have made that kind of distinction because one of the first things we have to do is attract people to the organization, select persons, complete the recruiting process. Then we're going to have to provide training, make sure they know what is required of them, and then you're going to have to manage their performance, and you're going to have to provide rewards accordingly. So I would have looked at it in that way. Now I just mentioned that we're now having a conversation on strategic HRM, not just a supportive function but a strategic partner to the organization. But it wasn't always that way, and what we would talk about on this slide is we'll go back perhaps 100 years or 120 years or so, and we would talk about how HR actually started and how it evolved through the decades. Over the period of 100 or 120 years, we talk about its evolution. So it began mainly as a welfare type function. So the HR officer or HR personnel back then in the 1900s were thought of in terms of the welfare officer or welfare personnel. Around the 1900s, you had an increase in technological advances, and you also had increased economic breakthroughs. People started doing better, and as a result of people doing better and economic growth within countries, organizations began to do better, and people's demands for increased goods and services came about around that time. There was an increased demand for goods and services from individuals. If we had to produce more goods and services, a linear relationship would be we may need more persons employed within organizations. More persons being employed within organizations would call for more organization of logistics. As a result of that, there was a need for persons to look after the welfare of these large numbers of individuals working within organizations. This person was identified and was called the welfare officer. But at that point, their main function was ensuring that persons had their breaks, ensuring that there was a canteen or cafeteria type setup where persons could go when they're on their breaks, where they could get snacks or lunch, or use their snacks and lunches that they would have brought. So mainly the function was ensuring that persons had scheduled breaks, they had scheduled lunchtime, they had a place where these things could happen. That's essentially what happened around the 1900s. As you progress from the 1900s, you had persons paying attention to what was going on, what was going right, what was going wrong, what problems they were solving, what areas for improvement they were targeting. And it progressed from just looking after persons' break and their lunches, and the fact that meals are provided for them, and they began paying attention to the type of persons that they were recruiting to the organization. They began providing some sort of training for persons in the organization. They began keeping records. They began doing appraisals of people's behavior within the organization, appraisals of people's performance within the various departments. They began trying to discover ways to control the behavior of persons within the organization towards the organizational objectives. And the welfare officer, who at that point was the individual that was looking after the well-being of personnel within the organization or the company, was deemed as the ideal fit to take on that role of administrating personnel activities. So that person became known as the personal administrator, with a support team that looked after recruiting, training, records, performance appraisal, controlling the behaviors of staff, as well as the previous function of the logistics with break time and number of hours worked, and ensuring that employees were provided for. So from the 1900s to about the 1920s, 30s, thereabout, you saw these kinds of shift taking place, because the role of the welfare officer was deemed to be inadequate, because larger numbers of persons were coming into the organizations were growing, and there was an increased need to improve productivity within the organization. So that change took place around the 1920s to the 1930s. Around the 1930s, 1940s, progressing to 1950s and 1960s, you had persons not just looking after the recruitment and training and controlling and performance management, but you began seeing changes where persons looked at manpower planning. What are the vacancies that exist? What are the vacancies that would exist in time to come? What are the ideal persons to fill these vacancies? So the role increased to include treating with challenges in relation to manpower planning, providing training, and not just training to prepare individuals to do tasks within the organization as it was currently configured, but in terms of the direction that the organization was going, how do we develop our workforce to take us in that direction, to ensure that we are competitive going in the new direction, keeping abreast of changes in technology, keeping abreast of the discoveries that were being made in various academic disciplines. All around that time you had, and we will talk about it in a subsequent discussion when we are talking about motivation, but you had different persons looking at how you could get a motivated workforce. You had Elton Mayo and his team, and they were involved in something called the Hawthorne studies, which we would mention at a subsequent point. So there was a need for organizations to build on all that they were discovering, to take advantage of opportunities, to minimize disputes within the organization. You started to have trade unions rising and defending workers' rights, and management attempting to get the most out of the arrangement in the interest of their businesses. So you had all these kinds of things happening, and there was a need now for the personal administrator to become like a personal manager And the shift in the role was not just one who looked after processes in terms of getting persons into the organization, getting them trained, etc., but someone who managed the organization against the backdrop of a concern for the worker as well as a concern for productivity. So you had various theories of motivation coming into being at that point in time. As I mentioned, Elton Mayo's early work, it gave way to things like Douglas McGregor, which we will talk about, Theory X, Theory Y. It gave way to one of the more popular models, Abraham Maslow, with his hierarchy of needs. And then we had Clayton Alderfer looking at Maslow's theory and making certain changes with the ERG theory, existence, relatedness, and growth theory. So we had a number of human resource motivation type theories being brought to bear on studies that were taking place at that point in time. And because the personnel administrator no longer focused on administrating processes, but focused on navigating these theories, these findings against what was going on in their organization, they moved from personnel administrator to personnel manager, managing within the organization in terms of productivity as well as a concern for a person's well-being and the quality of work life that a person experienced while in the organization. And that occurred around the 1940s, 1950s, 1960s, thereabout. As we progress to the 1960s, so in addition to the services provided in the earlier phases, which we just talked about, other areas covered in the functions of personnel management were organizational development and human resource development. So organizational development looked at problems within the organization or the need for planned change within the organization or means by which the organization could grow into the vision that top management, senior management had for the organization. A differentiation was made between change that was happening to an organization or within an organization, and a differentiation was made towards planning change, taking control of what's going on in the company itself as a function of what's going on in the external environment in terms of the discoveries that were being made through academia, in terms of the technological advances, in terms of the behavior of the competition. So organizational development became something critical or something focal around that point in time. Additionally, you had the academic discipline of human resource development, where increased attention was paid to providing training and development opportunities, and persons began looking at how people learn, how individuals can better serve the organization, how you could better transfer training from a classroom type setting into actual day-to-day performances, how you could evaluate the training that was being done, how you could monitor and evaluate the new behaviors as a result of the training being conducted. So when we move from personnel manager or human resource manager just looking after motivation of employees and streamlining of processes, we move towards a big focus on how could we develop the organization, how could we develop the human resources within the organization, how could we improve in terms of performance management, how could we improve in terms of compensation management, how could we have different kinds of pay structures that would support what we're trying to achieve, that would support the behaviors that we're trying to have from our employees. How could we look at industrial relations in a manner that does not necessarily have to be adversarial? So all these things came about around the 1960s, 1970s thereabout, and you move from just the personnel manager to a human resource manager with a focus on organizational development, human resource development, increased attention to manpower planning, compensation, motivation as well. So once we added functions to the human resource management area of focus, we didn't necessarily take away because there was still a need to do everything else that was happening, just doing it at perhaps better level or a more informed perspective. In the 1970s and progressing beyond that point, various developments challenged the economic and political stability that they had in times gone by. They had increased business competition, you had changes in customers' needs and expectation, you had technological advances, because you had technological advances all the way through. Changing the philosophy of employee relations, we began having a more adversarial type relationship with an effort to smoothen things out between employees and management. And you had a lot of advances in academia. Attempting to address these challenges, personal management was redefined and the concept of human resource management was adopted. So fully around the 1970s, progressing to around the 1990s, you had fully the human resource manager around that point in time. And building on the knowledge accumulated in the previous decades and the research that was being conducted, particularly within the 1980s and the early 1990s, organizational strategy was the best option for responding to the challenges facing organizations. So organizational strategy, how could we come up with strategy that would allow us to deal with all the things we talk about: increasing business competition, changes in customers' needs and expectation, technological advances, change in philosophies in relation to employee relations or industrial relations, all that we were learning from academia. How could we use what is happening here to formulate strategy such that the organization could remain on top of its game? HR operations at that point then became a function of organizational strategy. Everything that we're going to do within the human resource and within our human resource practices must be as a function of our organizational strategy. What would cause our organization to operate to its strengths, to be able to navigate around its weaknesses, or in some cases strengthen areas of weaknesses? What would cause the organization to be able to take advantage of opportunities and to, of course, work around threats or render threats useless, such that the organization continues to be viable and continue to be competitive? Now, at that point, as I mentioned, we had the organization not necessarily being, we had human resource management not necessarily being simply support function, but adopting that kind of positioning as a strategic partner of the organization, a strategic partner in business. Okay, so essentially we wanted to talk in this video about the evolution of human resource management through the years. What we talked about is the fact that it began as a welfare officer, just looking after the needs of large numbers of persons within the organization under one roof. And it progressed to the stage where we began paying attention to the persons that we were recruiting, better efforts at record keeping, better efforts at training, etc. It progressed again based on all the research that was going on, everything that was going on in academia, everything that was being discovered in the workplace, to the look at how human resources could be motivated to greater levels of productivity. It progressed again to how the organization as a whole could arrange itself for greater levels of productivity, greater levels of competitiveness, greater levels of stabilizing what's going on between employees and management, the business and its stakeholders. Progressed again to where strategy was important, strategy was key in causing the organization to be effective, and the HR department, human resource management, had to take the positioning of a strategic partner. So, just in case some of us may prefer reading rather than listening, I've included some slides here that you could pause the video and look at. These slides is everything that I talked about from the 1900s what happened there in the 1920s to 1930s. This is what happened here. So you could pause the video and look at these slides if you prefer to read. All right, in the 1940s, so around the 1960s, these are the things we talked about. You see the early work of Elton Mayo, who looked at the Hawthorne studies, and around the 1920s, you had Douglas McGregor coming right after, talking about theory X, theory Y. You had Herzberg, and then you had Herzberg talked about the two-factor theory, differentiated motivators from hygiene factors. We're going to talk about these things in detail in a subsequent lecture. You had Maslow talking about the hierarchy of needs. You had Clayton Alderfer building on Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And you had other guys like David McClellan, Victor Vroom, John Stacey Adams. We will talk about these things in a subsequent discussion. You have slides here where we talk about what happened around the 1960s, 1970s. Specialized attention was paid to disciplines such as recruitment and selection, training and development, performance management, compensation management, employee motivation, industrial relations. So you had academic disciplines, standalone academic disciplines in these areas around that time. And then, of course, building on all that was going on, you had human resource management coming into its own, and it up to today it's still called human resource management. And it came into that kind of framework to not only look after staff and not only look at processes within the organization, but to look after staff well-being, look after processes within the organization, but to cause the organization to be as competitive as it could be, and to cause it to be seen as a good organization to be a part of. And then we talked about strategic HRM, which came around the 1990s, 2000, thereabout, and it necessitated that the human resource management be seen as a strategic partner. So you have these slides that you could look at. You could pause the video and look at these slides. Okay. So in terms of reflecting on this video or the content of this video, here are some questions you could try to answer. Within the evolution of HRM through the years, what are your views on the changes which took place? So, for example, what took place prior to the 1940s? So if we go back to 1900s, to 1900 or so, to 1940s, what was really going on in relation to HR management, which we talked about? What were the challenges with what was happening? Why couldn't organizations remain at that level? What were the new changes around the 1940s? And what were they intended to achieve? And of course, you could present a discussion on the other changes that were necessary subsequent to 1940s up to this present time, and share your views on why you believe they were necessary. Now, to end this video, remember we're having a conversation, not so much that we could become the best HR managers there might be, but we are having a conversation in terms of how we could serve as internal consultants to organizations for which we may be employed, how we could serve to support what is going on from the perspective of HR, or even external consultants where small companies might ask us to assist in improving their HR functions. So what you could do now is, when you're looking at that organization, your organization or any organization where you're evaluating their HR practices, you could now try to locate what you find, locate their HR practices, what you find in terms of what year or what period you think they are operating at. For example, if they have simply the welfare model, then maybe they are operating back in the 1920s or so. If they're just looking at record keeping and taking notes and things like that, maybe they're operating back in the 1920s, 1930s time frame. If they're operating at a level where HR is a strategic partner, then they're up to the time. So you could do that kind of evaluation as well. So this brings us to the end of this video. I hope the discussions we had serve the purpose of helping us to understand the progression of human resource management through the years. Until then, see you in the next video.